I'm gonna tell you something I've never said out loud before. There were 3 weeks this past winter where I didn't shower, didn't really eat, barely drank water. I just laid in my bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and let time pass over me like weather. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you anyway because it's the truth. And the truth is the only thing I have left of any of this. My name is Danny. I'm 31 years old. I run a small woodworking shop out of a rented unit off Research Boulevard in Austin, custom furniture mostly. Tables, shelving, built-ins, the occasional commission piece for someone who wants something made right. I learned the trade from my father. In the workshop behind the house I grew up in, the house on Clover Ridge Road in Cedar Park that doesn't belong to anyone in my family anymore. By the time I found out what my brother had done, it was already gone. The house, the workshop, all of it. And I'd been standing 40 minutes away the whole time, taking care of our mother, completely in the dark. My dad's name was Robert. Everyone called him Bobby. He died 9 years ago when a drunk driver ran a red light on FM 1431 at 7 in the morning on his way to pick up a lumber order. He was 44. I was 22. My brother Caleb was 19. I'm going to need you to understand something about my father before the rest of this makes any sense. He wasn't a complicated man. He didn't have a lot of money, didn't care much about having it, didn't talk about feelings or say I love you more than a handful of times that I can remember. What he did was, he showed up. Every single day. He was in that workshop by 6 a.m., and if I came out there on a Saturday morning, he'd hand me a piece of sandpaper and we'd work next to each other without talking for an hour, and that was more than most people get from their fathers in a lifetime. He taught me how wood moves, how it breathes, how a properly fitted joint doesn't need glue to hold. He taught me that if something's worth making, it's worth making, so it'll outlast you. I think about that a lot. The workshop was attached to the back of the house, cedar siding, a corrugated metal roof that drummed when it rained, sawdust permanently in the air. It smelled like pine resin and machine oil and something else I can't name. Something that was just him, just that place. After he died, I'd go out there sometimes and just stand in the middle of it and breathe. That sounds strange. I don't care. My mom's name was Linda. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in the extended family, who kept a garden even when her knees made it hard, who made biscuits from scratch on Sunday mornings and acted like it was nothing. After my dad died, she held herself together in this quiet, determined way that I think took more out of her than any of us understood at the time. She kept the house. She kept the garden. She kept the workshop exactly as my dad had left it. His tools on the pegboard in the same order, his work gloves on the hook by the door. Caleb left for Nashville about a year after the accident. Got a job offer, or said he did, and just went. He and I were never close in the way some brothers are, but we'd always had something. He was quieter than me, more inside his own head, hard to read in a way that could feel like coldness but wasn't, not really. When we were kids, he used to follow me and my dad out to the workshop and he'd sit on an overturned bucket for an hour, not saying anything, just watching. He didn't want to learn the work. He just wanted to be near it, near us. I understood that even then. After Nashville, he'd come back for Christmas, sometimes Thanksgiving, and there'd be this careful, slightly formal version of family that we'd all maintain for a few days before he drove back to his apartment and we went back to our regular lives. He called Mom every Sunday. That I know because she mentioned it, always mentioned it. Caleb called today, the way you mention something that matters to you. I stayed in Austin, stayed close. I'd go over to Cedar Park a couple times a month, help with things around the house, eat dinner with Mom, sit on the back porch and talk. After she started having trouble with her balance, this was maybe 4 years ago, I started going more. After the first fall, I started going every week. She was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia 2.5 years ago. If you don't know what that is, it's a particular kind of hard. It's not like the dementia you see in movies where someone just gets confused and forgetful and eventually doesn't recognize faces. Lewy body comes with hallucinations, with fluctuations, with days where she was almost completely herself and days where she was somewhere else entirely, talking to people who weren't there, frightened by things I couldn't see. There were nights I'd get a call at 2 in the morning and drive 40 minutes to find her standing in the backyard in her nightgown, looking for my dad. I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what those 2 years actually were. I rearranged my entire life around her schedule. I hired a part-time aide, a woman named Dolores, for the weekdays. But evenings and weekends were me. I learned her medications, her triggers, the particular way she needed things arranged to feel safe. I learned that she was better in the mornings and worse after 3 p.m. I learned that if I put Frank Sinatra on the kitchen radio, she'd calm down within 10 minutes almost every time. I learned how to clean up after someone who doesn't make it to the bathroom in time and how to do it without making them feel ashamed. I learned which of her hallucinations were frightening and which ones were okay to leave alone. One evening, she spent 45 minutes having a full conversation with my dad at the kitchen table. I sat across from her and didn't say a word and just let her have it. She needed her husband more than she needed her son in those moments, and I could be both for a few minutes, and it cost me nothing. I think about that more than almost anything else from those 2 years. Caleb came for Christmas that first year after the diagnosis. He was there for 4 days. He sat with Mom, talked to her, helped with dinner. On the last night before he drove back to Nashville, he and I sat on the back porch, and he said, "You're doing an incredible job, man. Seriously." And I said, "Thanks." And he said, "Let me know if you need anything." And I said, "Okay," and he left. And I'm not saying he was a bad person for leaving. His life was there. I don't fully understand what it costs a person to watch someone they love disappear the way Mom was disappearing. Maybe being far away was the only way he knew how to survive it. I've tried to be fair about that. I've tried. What I know is that over those 2 years, I became the person who was there. Every decision, every crisis, every Tuesday afternoon when Mom looked at me like she'd never seen me before in her life, and then 5 minutes later grabbed my hand and called me Bobby, and I had to decide whether to correct her or just hold her hand and be whoever she needed. I was there for all of it. Caleb was not. He called. I'll give him that. He called Mom on Sundays and me every couple of weeks, asked how things were going, said the right things, and something was off in those calls toward the end. Not wrong exactly, just slightly formal in a new way, like someone who was being careful about something. Mom died on a Wednesday morning in November. I was there. Dolores was there. It was quiet, which I think was mercy, which I think is all you can ask for. I called Caleb from the parking lot of the hospital. He was on the road to Austin within the hour. I'll give him that too. He arrived that evening, walked into the house, and I watched him stand in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at everything like he was taking inventory. I told myself I was reading into things. I told myself a lot of things in those first few days. We organized the funeral together. Caleb handled some of the calls. I handled others. We divided up the tasks the way you do when you're both running on no sleep and grief and old habit. There was something almost like closeness between us those few days, the way shared loss can do that. Pull people together briefly before everything else comes back in. After the service, after people had eaten and said their condolences and gone home, Caleb and I sat in the living room with 2 glasses of bourbon, and the house was very quiet. He said, "We should talk about the house." I said, "Yeah, eventually we can figure it out." He said, "I just mean it's a significant asset, and we should probably think about what makes sense." I said, "Sure, there's no rush." He said, "Right, yeah, no rush." I went back to my apartment that night. I had about 2 weeks of work backed up. I had about 48 hours of sleep to catch up on. I had a grief that I hadn't started to feel yet because I'd been too busy managing everything to actually feel it. I let 3 weeks go by before I called a probate attorney. Her name was Vanessa, referred to me by a guy I knew through the woodworking community. And when I sat across from her and told her mom had died and I wanted to understand what the estate situation looked like, she pulled up the Travis County property records and got very quiet in a particular way that I recognized immediately as the quiet of someone figuring out how to tell you something. The house on Clover Ridge Road had been transferred out of my mother's name 14 months before she died. Quitclaim deed, filed with the county recorder's office, signed by Linda Mae Garrett. Transferred to Caleb Robert Garrett, sole owner. I sat there and read the document 3 times. Vanessa explained it to me carefully. Lewy body dementia creates what she called a legally complicated situation because of the fluctuations. Because a person can appear oriented and capable in a brief window, and a notary has limited ability to assess cognitive capacity. She said that with the right elder law attorney, filed immediately after the transfer, there might have been grounds to contest. She used the word might. She said it 14 months ago the window was still open. She said it carefully, like she wanted me to understand she wasn't the one who made this happen. And then she asked me when I'd first found out about the transfer. "Today," I said, "just now." She nodded, and I sat there, and I started doing the math in my head. 14 months ago, that was the summer before last, and Caleb had visited that July for almost 2 weeks. Longer than usual. Long enough that I'd thought maybe he was finally coming back to something. And one afternoon, I'd had a client consultation across town, and Dolores had the day off, and I remember thinking, good, she's not alone. He's there. She wasn't alone. He was there. I thought about what Mom might have thought she was signing, whether she'd been having a good day or a bad one. whether she'd asked questions, whether any part of her had understood. I thought about the notary sitting at the kitchen table where we used to eat Sunday breakfast, putting a pen in my mother's hand. I asked Vanessa if there was still anything I could do. She said the transfer could still be contested. It would take time, it would be expensive, and the odds were genuinely uncertain. She said to let her look into it further and come back in a week. I drove home with something I can only describe as fragile hope. The kind that feels more like dread than hope, because you know exactly how it could break. I told myself, the house is still there. Nobody's done anything irreversible yet. There's still a week. I called Caleb that evening. He answered. I told him I'd spoken to a probate attorney. I told him I knew about the quitclaim deed. And he said, I'm going to remember this exact phrasing for the rest of my life. He said, Mom wanted me to have the house. She told me that. You were never around as much as you think you were. You were never around as much as you think you were. Something happened in my chest that I can't fully describe. Not rage exactly. More like a flash. 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Driving 40 minutes in the dark because she'd called me frightened and I could hear it in her voice. The medication organizer I refilled every Sunday. 7 little compartments, her name written on a piece of masking tape on the lid. The Frank Sinatra radio trick that took me 3 weeks to figure out by accident. The night she was sick and I cleaned up after her and told her it was okay, it was fine, it happens, and held her hand until she stopped crying. The afternoon she didn't know who I was at all, and I came anyway. Sat with her anyway. Because where else was I going to be? I almost said all of that. I had it right there, ready, a complete inventory of every Tuesday and every 2 a.m. and every Sunday organizer. And then something stopped me. Because I realized he already knew. He'd known the whole time. That wasn't a misunderstanding I could correct. That was a choice he'd made with full knowledge and decided to live with. So instead I said things I'm not going to repeat here because they weren't my best moment and they didn't matter anyway because he'd already hung up. I went back to Vanessa a week later. She looked at me across the desk and said there was one more thing she hadn't told me yet because she'd wanted to confirm it first. The house had already been sold. Closed 3 weeks after Mom's funeral. I reached for my bag on the way out of Vanessa's office and missed the handle the first time. Just grabbed air. I stood there for a second looking at my own hand like it belonged to someone else. Then I picked up the bag and walked out. I don't remember driving home from that meeting. I know I did because I ended up at my apartment, but I don't remember the drive. I remember sitting in my truck in the parking garage under my building for a long time looking at the concrete wall in front of me. I remember thinking about the workshop, about whether the new owners had kept it or torn it down, about whether my dad's tools were still on that pegboard, or whether they'd ended up in a donation box or a dumpster somewhere off 183. I remember not being able to stop thinking about the gloves on the hook by the door, and then I just stopped. The shop lights stayed off for 18 straight days. Dolores left 2 voicemails. I listened to both of them and couldn't make myself call back. The first one, she just asked if I was okay. The second one, she said she'd heard about the house and she was sorry, and if I needed anything, she was there. I played that one 3 times, lying in bed in the dark, and then set the phone face down on the nightstand. A client texted me about a dining table commission. I read it and put the phone down and didn't answer for 4 days. He texted again. I sent back dealing with a family situation, will be in touch soon, and he said no rush, take your time. And that small kindness from a stranger I'd met twice was almost more than I could hold. The sheets stopped being fresh sometime in the first week. I noticed and didn't get up. I ate when I remembered. Half a sleeve of crackers one day, a gas station sandwich the next. My body kept going whether I wanted it to or not. What I did, the thing that actually kept me moving at all, was remember. Not on purpose. I couldn't have stopped it if I wanted to. My brain just kept pulling thread. Dad on a Saturday morning, holding a board up to the window light, checking for flatness. The way he'd run his thumb along the grain without looking. How he'd hand me the sanding block without explaining anything. Just hand it to me and trust that I'd figure it out. Mom at the kitchen table with coffee and the crossword, pencil behind her ear, calling me by Dad's name and then laughing at herself. Her garden in April. The smell of it. The way she kept his workshop exactly as he'd left it because she couldn't let the shape of him disappear. Caleb on the overturned bucket. Just sitting there watching us work. Not asking to help, not getting in the way. Just wanting to be near it, near us. Then I made coffee. Small things. The kind of things that don't mean anything except that you're still doing them. I called Vanessa. Told her I wasn't going to pursue the contest. She didn't try to talk me out of it. She said she understood. She sent me a final invoice that was very reasonable, and I paid it, and that was that. I called Caleb one last time about a month after that first conversation, when I was steadier. He answered. I told him I wasn't going to pursue legal action. He said okay in this careful, slightly relieved voice. I told him I wanted him to understand something, not to hurt him, not to make him feel guilty, but because those things had happened and someone needed to say them out loud. I told him about the 2 a.m. drives, about the medication organizer, about the Frank Sinatra trick, about the night she didn't know who I was and I came anyway, about the evenings she called me Bobby, and I just let her, because I'd learned by then that she needed him more than she needed me, and I could give her that much at least. I told him I wasn't saying any of it to be cruel. I was saying it because it was real and it deserved to exist somewhere outside my own head. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I know. Just that. 2 words. I know. I said okay and hung up, and I haven't spoken to him since. I don't know what he meant by it. I don't know if it was acknowledgement or guilt or grief or something he'd been carrying that finally had somewhere to land. I've stopped trying to figure it out. Some things don't resolve into something you can understand, and you just have to carry them as they are. I went back to the house on Clover Ridge Road on a Sunday afternoon in February. I don't know exactly what I was expecting. I just needed to see it. They'd painted the front door. Red now. It used to be this dark forest green my dad had picked out in 1997 and touched up every few years to match. The garden along the front walk was still there. Different plants, but someone was tending it. I noticed that. I don't know why it mattered, but it did. I sat in my truck across the street for a while. And then the dining room light came on. The big window that faces the street. The one where we used to eat Sunday dinners. And I could see them in there. A family. Parents. 2 kids. A dog threading between chairs. They were having dinner. One of the kids said something, and the whole table lit up for a second. That particular brightness that happens when everyone laughs at once. I couldn't hear it, but I knew exactly what it sounded like. We looked like that once. Around that table, in that room, in that light. I sat there until the light in the dining room went out and they moved somewhere deeper into the house. Then I drove home. The next morning, I got to the shop before 7. I unlocked the door and hit the lights and stood in the middle of it for a moment. Pine resin, machine oil, the particular cold of a space that's been closed for a few weeks. The half-finished dining table commission was still on the bench where I'd left it, waiting. I took my apron off the hook and put it on. Ran my hand along the edge of the workbench, my dad's workbench, the one piece of his I'd managed to keep, the one thing that had made it out of that workshop before the house sold. The wood was smooth in the middle from 30 years of use, still rough at the edges. I picked up the hand plane, checked the blade, set it against the board. First pass, a thin curl of pine came up clean, and the smell of it filled the shop. And for just a second, I was 12 years old, and it was a Saturday morning, and my dad was standing right beside me. I kept working. So guys, I'm glad you've listened to this far, and if you enjoyed this story, please support the channel with a like and subscribe. Also, check out my other interesting stories in the upcoming videos. See you later!